Hello, my name is Faye Saida. I am a PhD student in the Department of Sociology at Michigan State University, and thank you for attending my talk today about Queering Food Work, a critical discourse analysis of domestic food work research. So this work is based on my master's thesis in food systems and society, which I received from Marylhurst University in 2018, and is something that I am still working on, so considered a work in progress as the body of research and what is considered best practice, particularly concerning the queer community, is continually changing. So food work in this context includes meal planning, shopping, preparation, cooking, cleanup, and the emotional labor associated with providing food for others. Domestic food work itself has long been an area of study to understand the intersection between food, gender, and power in the domestic realm, and is also as a means to highlight the subordination of women. In its desire to do so, however, it has often reinscribed oppression through the exclusion of relationships and identities that do not fit the dominant narrative. For the purpose of this presentation, I am only going to be focusing on the cis heteronormativity of this research, but in my thesis, I do interrogate race and class as well. The rest of the presentation will demonstrate how domestic food work discourse perpetuates cis heteronormativity through both the language and categories used and the types of individuals and relationships studied. First, I'll go over the theory and method, then discuss queer inclusion, heteronormativity, homonormativity, nuclear families, and end with recommendations for future research. So the foundation of this work rests on Jung's work in the five faces of oppression, including cultural imperialism, which involves the universalization of a dominant group's experiences and culture, and its establishment as the norm, making the experiences of outside groups both invisible and marked as other. This concept assists us in understanding how domestic food work discourse utilizes dominant narratives to render invisible the identities of oppressed groups. A prime reason advocating for this is directly related to Jung's description of violence, because it is the otherness and invisibility of groups that make violent acts against them acceptable. So, as Jung argues, quote, what makes violence a face of oppression is less the particular acts themselves, but the social context surrounding them, which makes them possible and even acceptable, end quote. This violent erasure embodied by discourse is further elaborated by McCann, the quote which is on the slide here, who writes, to settle on a subject category, then, is to reinscribe a fixity that excludes some, often in violent ways, for example, those who are literally erased because their bodies do not conform to a discrete binary. This example in particular is referring to how the dichotomy of gendered categories like man and women, masculine and feminine, operate to erase queer individuals whose genders do not fit into these distinctions. As a record number of trans bills sweep the nation this year, including but not limited to prohibitions on healthcare for transgender youth, enforcement of single-sex facilities, the exclusion of transgender youth from athletics, and restricting identification documents, it is clear that cis heteronormative discourse concerning gender roles has a widespread impact on who is considered worthy of existence. So the reason I wanted to use critical discourse analysis in this work primarily stemmed from my own experience reading all this domestic food work research in class, discussing women's subordination and gender roles concerning food work, but not seeing my identity or experiences as a bisexual person of color represented. And so queering food work research can highlight how gender roles can be transformed and resisted through discourse and inclusion. And critical discourse analysis in particular can provide the method for doing that. And so, as Fairclough and Wodak emphasize, quote, every instance of language use makes its own small contribution to reproducing and or transforming society and culture. That is why it is worth struggling over, end quote. Queer theory also dictates the methodological approach for understanding how discourse reproduces and maintains cis heteronormativity in domestic food work research through both binary language and a lack of inclusion. It functions to, quote, interrogate and deconstruct the binaries of male versus female, homosexual versus heterosexual, and feminine versus masculine, end quote. If you can't tell already, I have a thing against binaries. And so ultimately, me using queer theory will take a central part in highlighting how these rigid dichotomies of gender and sexuality used in the categorizations and language of domestic food work discourse function to limit the scope and breadth of findings. With this all in mind, though, it is important to recognize that although the gender binary limits the way that research is conceptualized and analyzed, I'm not advocating for, a so-called destruction of gender, but for gender expansiveness and self-determination, which also recognizes that gender categories, although often oppressive, also act as a category through which we engage in political transformation and resistance. Because of this, I am also thinking about the theories of doing gender, coined by Weston Zimmerman, and more current conceptions of undoing gender and redoing gender, all of which have been used to describe both queer and non-queer divisions of domestic food labor. In its original form, Doing Gender contends that gender is not a set of traits, nor a variable, nor a role, but the product of social doings constituted through social interactions, and can act as the basis for how gender roles persist in actions of everyday life, including food work. Undoing Gender, on the other hand, acknowledges the importance of the original theory, but notes how it has become a theory of gender persistence and inevitability of inequality, and thus requires a reframing for how we can undo gender. Lastly, Redoing Gender takes us a step further by queering it, challenging normative gender roles, or creating alternatives for how gender organizes social life, such as through enacting an egalitarian division of labor. A primary goal of domestic food work research is highlighting how gender roles and relationships shape food work in the home and within the food system, particularly through demonstrating the subordination of women. So the work of Murcott, Charles and Kerr, and DeVault, who wrote the influential work Feeding the Family, for example, all observed women as subordinate providers to the dominant food needs of their wage-providing husbands, which has a large influence on the body of domestic food work research today. And although this work is undoubtedly important, domestic food work discourse continues to be limited by its perpetuation of cis heteronormativity, by excluding queer participants, and using gendered categories and language. This gendered discourse, both within and outside of food work, is discussed relationally, whereby men and women are viewed as counterparts who perform gender both in tandem and in contrast to each other, leaving experiences and identities outside of these norms invisible. Moving beyond the gendered nature of food work to embody new, fluid roles requires rethinking who we include in research, the language used to describe participants and their actions, and the categories used to understand research results. So the vast majority of articles that I looked at utilize heterosexual individuals in their research to understand different meanings and ways of doing gender associated with food work. This is not surprising, given the background of domestic food work as a largely feminist project that understood how women's oppression and gender inequality is reproduced and maintained in the home. Although some studies acknowledge that only heterosexual participants were included, a number of them failed to mention this limitation of their research sample. And by not specifying the dominant sexuality included in the research, heterosexuality is then solidified as an unquestioned norm, rendering the existence and experiences of queer identities invisible. In addition to excluding queer participants, research perpetuated cis heteronormativity in a variety of ways, and here I've separated them into research that included binary categories, had categories that could be considered beyond the binary, and then degendered categories. And so ways of doing gender are often tied to binary separations of masculine and feminine, which fail to accurately portray the spectrum and complexity of gender and the relationships surrounding food work. In the first example, Szabo's account of men nurturing through food categorizes men as enacting traditional culinary masculinities and traditional culinary femininities, with the former representing cooking as a skill, leisure, and/or seduction, and the latter representing cooking as care-oriented. Dichotomy used in other senses, such as public male and private female by Murcott, and leisure male and care female by Cairns, are also seen as reinscribing the gender binary and limiting our conceptions of doing gender to either or categorizations. Some researchers do attempt to move beyond these dualistic categories or recognize the limited nature of separating results into opposing classifications. In their discussion of foodie discourse, for example, Cairns et al. Refused to categorize the way that gender is challenged and reinforced as being progressive or traditional, but present them as collective evidence of the particular ways that foodie discourse offers opportunities to do and redo hegemonic gender norms. The association of food work as either masculine leisure or feminine care work is additionally challenged by Szabo's description of how men experience cooking as work leisure, and Cairns et al., who illustrate how women emphasize their own pleasure via their identity as foodies. The private female and public male categories used by Murcott are additionally blurred by Mea in their discussion of power and gender in cooking spaces, where they describe how the home does not reflect a neatly demarcated boundary between public and private, but rather a space that is inherently political, where gendered relations are both lived out and relentlessly reinforced, producing and reproducing gender-based subjectivities. Lastly, although Szabo's iteration of traditional culinary masculinities and femininities is a binary category in itself, the pluralization of the terms to better represent the range of behaviors and feelings, in addition to the tensions between different masculinities and femininities in different contexts, can be seen as going a step in the right direction and going beyond binary thinking. Despite this, these dichotomized categories still manage to remind its audience of gendered associations with food work. Moving towards a reality where all genders can occupy different domestic roles and spaces fluidly is continually limited through the categorization of different spaces and tasks as being masculine or feminine. Several research studies combat this through classifying food work roles based on their actual components and related responsibilities rather than the genders that they are normatively associated with. Bove and Sobel, for example, associated individuals as occupying a primary food worker role, assistant or sous chef role, and/or primary food shopping role. Lupton, on the other hand, created categorizations based on the perceptions of participants themselves. And so they asked what percentage participants cooked in comparison with their partner, and then let them justify the results with each other. This resulted in 3 categories: one partner cooking more than the other, both partners sharing somewhat equally, or other food work options such as both partners cooking for themselves. Kelly and Hawk, on the other hand, refrained from categories altogether and instead provided specific examples of how queer participants justified gender roles in relation to power and redoing gender as a way to demonstrate a multitude of rationales. Lastly, and similarly to Lupton, Kentland also used degendered categories and additionally used a degendered scale of treble and bass to describe how queer couples engaged in domestic labor. So I've talked a lot about queer inclusion thus far, but unfortunately, solely including queer identities doesn't always end up in positive results and can actually perpetuate what is called homonormativity. So homonormativity is understood as the normalization of gay identities within the context and assumptions of a heteronormative culture. And although normalization itself can be regarded as positive, homonormativity limits societal understandings of queer identities through a heteronormative lens that can lead towards erasure. And so in the articles that I looked at, very few of them actually investigated solely queer individuals in their research, and only one focused explicitly on queer individuals in food work. And so I actually expanded my sample to include articles that looked at domestic labor and not just food work. These articles contest heteronormative ways of inclusion and categorizations while still drawing from dominant heteronormative conceptions through homonormativity. And so one way that it can impact research is through the assumption that queer couples reflect heteronormative relationships. And so Kentland's research on same-sex couples' divisions of housework in Queensland plays on this heteronormative assumption through their article's title, Who's the Man and Who's the Woman? An invasive question that many queer couples are familiar with. Kelly and Hawk similarly reject this notion, arguing that same-gender couples cannot rely on sex category to divide up housework, and that queer couples don't always view their specialized divisions of labor as heteronormative or as reproducing masculine and feminine roles. Studies by Sobel and Bove and Sobel both reference Carrington's study to confirm alignment between heterosexual and queer patterns of domestic food work. The former writes how similar patterns in their study may also apply to homosexual unions, while the latter bring up how other work suggests that homosexual couples have similar housework patterns. And although there is no denying that a similarity of patterns could exist, Carrington's research is unfortunately the only study that explicitly documents feeding working queer families that is frequently referenced. And the referencing of a single study should be viewed with concern, particularly when this could further justify the lack of research involving queer individuals if we are concluded to all be just the same. So these assumptions are also related to an overrepresentation of research focusing on individuals in nuclear family structures, which as a cultural norm fails to demonstrate how households typically operate food work. Work has expanded in this area beyond what Kemmer in 2000 saw as being focused on solely the life stages of childbearing and child rearing, to now include research on how food work adapts through different lifestyle changes such as marriage, aging, and widowing, and documenting individuals in different living situations such as living alone, with parents, or with roommates. Food work research that specifically includes household structures such as those composed of multiple families, multiple generations, polyamorous households, or unrelated individuals excluding romantic couples, however, is underrepresented or almost non-existent. So, recommendations for future research include first, employing terminology that avoids binary thinking, such as through assigning roles that are descriptive of behavior instead of gender, such as meal planner, dishwasher, leisure oriented, care oriented, and also allowing for participants to occupy more than one category. When roles are assigned, great care should also be taken not to make assumptions over whether roles are more feminine or masculine than others, such as was the case with Szabo's 2012 research, where leisure was associated with masculinity and care with femininity. This type of alignment disregards the capacity of men to do care work, women to engage in leisure, and for all individuals to engage in both care and leisure roles in their daily lives. Second, I recommend using a scale or spectrum instead of opposing dual categories to better represent the range of stances individuals and behaviors can represent. A spectrum further acknowledges that doing gender is not stagnant and is directly related to time, space, and circumstance. Through this, researchers can better pinpoint the ways that doing gender can change among individuals and families engaging in domestic food work. Spectrums are frequently used in the queer community to describe sexual and romantic attraction and gender, so it makes sense to employ this type of model to domestic food work discourse that acknowledges queer relationships. Third, I recommend acknowledging the identities of research subjects. And so, as I said previously, many articles were not explicit in naming whether their research only focused on dominant categories of representation. Although there is no doubt that this research had valuable insights into domestic food work division and enactment, rationale should still be developed as to why specific groups and/or identities are studied or acknowledged over others. If it is not possible within a study to fully interrogate multiple aspects of identity, such as race, class, sexuality, ability, etc., it should at least be acknowledged that gaps may exist because of this and that greater research still needs to be done. My last recommendation is a greater focus on how power and socioeconomic status drives inequity and oppression. So this presentation did not discuss the inclusion of marginalized race and class populations, just for time's sake, but the inclusion of intersectionality theory in future research is incredibly important. So despite Judith Butler's description of how, quote, gender intersects with racial, class, ethnic, sexual, and regional modalities of discursively constituted identities, making it impossible to separate out gender from the political and cultural intersections in which it is invariably produced and maintained, end quote. Much of their research examined attempts to consider gender without including these other factors. This adherence to a dominant narrative not only excludes marginalized individuals, but can serve to mark their experiences as invalid or other. So, in concluding this presentation, I encourage academics to use their frames of study to acknowledge how global power structures of racism, classism, sexism, and cis heteronormativity impact marginalized groups, and further, how discourse can work to reify this marginalization within research and society. Thank you so much.